Steffi, thank you so much. And Steffi is the greatest junction maker, bringing us together not only during DLD here in Munich, but all year long. Life would not be the same without these permanent junctions Steffi creates all year long between the disciplines. So please give a very big applause for Steffi Czerny. And it's now my immense pleasure to ask Kasper König on stage, my great hero, mentor, inspiration, from whom I learned everything. We will today have a chapter in, actually a conversation in 2 chapters, as we are having an infinite conversation for almost 30 years. This is almost perfect because the 20 minutes are of course not enough. So we'll have chapter 1 this morning about Münster, and then chapter 2 this afternoon. Please give a very warm welcome to Kasper König.
Also eigentlich müsste der Hans Ulrich Schweizerdeutsch sprechen und ich Plattdeutsch. Because if we would speak in our native languages, the greeting would not be so emphatic, certainly not on my part. It's a very different temperament. But I hear that in the conference, there's also the Archbishop of Munich talking, which I find very interesting. I left the church a long time ago, and I like the quote of Billy Wilder, who has been asked, what's your relationship to God? And he said, fine, I just have problems with the ground crew. And when we entered, there were 2 photographs. Hans Ulrich on the right, I was on the left. And I just told him a wonderful story from German television, some of these talk shows. Usually they're very clumsy. And this was a subject about children of prominent people, either mother or father, whatever. And the general tendency was that it was not so good, except Geraldine Chaplin talked about a situation which she thought was memorable. She was in a jury of a film festival, I think in Cannes, and she was at a drugstore to get what was necessary for medical purposes. She was standing in line. There were 2 women, very aggressive, said, I know who this person is, but I don't know her name. And by the time she returned with the medicine, she overheard them. They were very aggressive. Yes, I know who she is. She's a daughter of Laurel and Hardy. Now, this is an inner joke because we have a very intense relationship to some artists who are duos, like Fischli Weiss, Gilbert and George,
Bernd and Hilla Becher,
Bernd and so on. So it's kind of interesting, the whole kind of talk about gender, about all these topics which are so current, political correctness. We have had the, I would say, wonderful privilege to not take these things overtly serious because we were dealing with some of these issues primarily because our connection to art is in a different way. Huh?
And also what Peter Fischli and David Weiss often said, the unbelievable advantage there is if you're 2, 1 + 1 is much more than 2. It can easily be 11, that you permanently bounce off ideas each other, you learn from each other, you edit each other, etc., etc. And that, of course, plays not only a role in art practice, but it plays a role in curating, where very often exhibitions are co-curated by 2 people. And I think in English one says 2 is a company, 3 is a crowd. And very often this sort of dialogue between 2 curators is particularly productive. And of course, for me it all started, I had not done any bigger exhibition until Kasper, you invited me to do this painting show together with the Broken Mirror, which was a ping pong. But you've, for many years before, for many decades, done exhibitions with someone else. For example, also the case for Westkunst with Laszlo Gloser, and of course also the show we're going to talk about today, Münster, which is a dialogue initially very strongly with Klaus Bussmann. So maybe it's a good point to start.
Yeah,
no?
yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about how it all began with Münster and with you and Klaus Bussmann and the beginnings?
You see, Münster is a very conservative town. I think, the fourth largest university in Germany. It used to be the third largest in West Germany. I think it's the fourth largest now in Germany. And it was completely wiped out in the Second World War. 92% of the historical inner city was wiped out. The advantage of the bombardment by the British was that there were fire bombs, so they would not make craters. The houses would just collapse because of this enormous heat. And Münster was bombed in retaliation of the German Wehrmacht bombing Coventry, which had no military purpose. So that's when the psychological war started. Now, since the sewage remained, the city was rebuilt basically on its old layout. But it was quasi-modernized, so it's a kind of Disneyland. It's a kind of post-modernist city avant de lettres. And it is very liberal. It thinks of itself very highly, but as a certain kind of repressive liberalism. But then conservatism can also have a certain advantage that you don't have to change things notoriously all the time when they somehow work. So I come from a very bourgeois family. I left when I was 19. I didn't even do the alternative service. I was not a pacifist. So then I left Germany for about altogether 15 years because I couldn't come back. So I have a very emotional relationship to where I come from. Basically, it was based on rejecting it. And then while my mother was still alive and I was asked to work along with Bussmann, who founded this exhibition, I have a kind of hate-love relationship, and it is very challenging to do this every 10 years. So this is against the grain, and 10 years is an interesting period. It's not only a local period, which is typical for the temperament of the Münsterland, the Westphalian people, which was always very anti-Prussian, and it has a very particular kind of Catholicism, very kind of also the Baroque of Münster is quite beautiful, but it is low-key. So the exhibition started because Henry Moore was to be placed at the university. Now, the university said no because they were afraid, that's an interpretation, that they wanted to be too much like off the time. The city itself, the business people, they wanted business to go on. The university pretended that there were not so much Nazis, which was nonsense. Everybody was a Nazi. So they rejected Henry Moore because it was too modern, and they didn't want it to be caught being opportunist again. I mean, that's my interpretation. So Klaus Bussmann, who is a very great art historian, architecture specialist, said what is necessary is to educate, to make an exhibition on the history of modern sculpture, from Rodin to Calder. And so I was living in New York at the time. He asked me, we didn't know each other, but his sister and my sister went to school together. And his mother and my mother went on a bus trip to Brussels to the World's Fair with a local Catholic church. So it was a very kind of a family bonding. We didn't know each other.
So you saw the Atomium?
Yes, yeah. Yes. And I saw also the American Pavilion with Saul Steinberg, which of made him the show. And I saw the Sputnik and so on. And I was very interested as a kid in literature and film, not in art at all. But then when I got involved, and I never had English in school and so on, I went to a kind of humanist school, which started with Latin and Greek, and even in the end Hebrew for Catholic priests. But I was thrown out of the school. So when I went to London, when I lived in Milan, when I went to New York, I learned English because I was interested in pictures, and therefore, I went to some lectures and so on. Now, Münster is particular because it's every 10 years. In 10 years, I was responsible for what was called Projekte. There were 12 artists invited, and all of them were men. And nobody thought it was strange, neither we. Only 10 years later, we realized how ridiculous it was.
So that's the 77.
Yeah, but sculpture was very much related to architecture, and that was a very male-dominated kind of situation. Thank God this situation has really changed. Now, for instance, this piece of Karl André I mean, he's famous for interpreting Brancusi, but instead of the endless column, in a non-hierarchical way going up the air, he just put it on the ground. So he overcame the base. This is formally very important in terms of contemporary art history. If you look at the history of mathematics or physics or so, then there are also certain inventions which have changed or extended the idea of mathematics. So, and this was called it was called a line for Professor Landauer. Professor Landauer was a local priest, and he was very enchanted by natural science, and the bishop threw him out. And then he started a zoo and made theater in Lower German, and all the female roles were taken by men. So it was also a kind of a gay, wonderful gay travesty. And basically, these theater plays are very simple. The postman rings, he gets a schnapps, and then one leg isn't enough. You get a second schnapps, you get a third schnapps, and everybody in the audience is also drinking. So after about an hour, the whole thing is a fucking chaos because people are completely wiped out, and it's very beautiful, right? Okay. Now, this is a very significant piece of Michael Asher, an artist from Los Angeles, who was definitely interested in urbanism. And a book which was very influential at the time among the artists was Learning from Las Vegas, right?
Venturi Scott Brown, yeah.
Right. And it's basically a reflection on why postmodernism came about, but quite early. And he placed a caravan for every week in another location, from the inner city to the suburbs and back. So the caravan was just a metaphor for a house moving. And it's very typical for California and the opposite of what Münster is about.
And so this piece kept coming back because it's 77, right. 87.
And now, 97. Unfortunately, he died. And I always promised Michael, I said, as long as you are around, the exhibition has to go on. But we are not doing it again. First, it was completely ignored, even by reviews. The second time, they said, oh, it's old hat. It's conceptual art as we know it. And so he was basically, the inventor was sort of put aside. But the fourth time around, it became an indicator of change because certain locations, that you couldn't park it anymore. More shopping, more luxury shopping, more kind of super ideal kind of fucking utopia by buying things and so on. And that is very interesting because change is not easy to understand because you change with it. And therefore, you need a certain kind of a distancing to understand. But this is interesting in looking back. And there is another piece which I'll show you. For instance, boys, we asked boys to participate. Boys said to do something in the public realm, in the city. It's ecological kitsch, right? And then I said, Herr Boys, why do you participate? He said, we shouldn't leave it up to the Americans. And he was very smart. He understood that American artists had a different relationship because in America, everything is private. Even if you go to university, if you go to the Museum of Modern Art, ultimately it's private. It's a different genesis. It's a different understanding. And therefore, he picked a site which was a kind of a gateway to a new lecture hall of the university for people who are disabled. This was a typical social democratic kind of symbol. Look, we are in favor of. By the time the lecture hall was running, the janitor locked it, right? And Beuys had this intuitive notion. So he put salt in the wound, so to speak, okay? Now, this is probably the most interesting work at all because it was rejected 3 times.
And we actually published it because in 97, it was in the book of Unrealized Project.
Unrealized Project. And Bruce Nauman, his background actually is mathematics and physics and music. And he is really an amazing artist. And he made this called Square Depression. It's a true negative pyramid. If you're inside, you look at people looking at you. So it's about looking and being looked at. It's very psychological and it deals with space, which is public and private. So, for instance, his favorite work of art is a painting of George Tucker, who is a painter from the 40s, a communist painter who was very badly treated by McCarthy and so on, where you see in the subway of New York people talking on the public telephone. So it's a very personal thing, talking on the telephone. I'm late, but maybe he's going for a drink, whatever. It's like a movie situation. It is, you can see it, but you don't hear it. And his work very much reflects with a public interchange. It was rejected because it's between two institutes, one of organic and one of inorganic chemistry. And they said the university is trying to merge us. Therefore, we don't want this work of art. This is a trick. Then people didn't like it because it was concrete, beton, right? So beton was very, very, very popular among punks, among, punk rock. But the bourgeois hated, they wanted to go back to stone and so on. So then ultimately it was done under the same condition as he made in 77. So the whole goddamn thing, he got an honorarium of something like 15,000 D-Mark, which was 8,000 euro. And by that, he has become a very, very famous artist. And since you can't move these things, it is not so much subject to speculation. And I've always said, don't make anything for the reason that it should stay. Because if an artist does that, they make internal kind of compromises. And it should just be an intervention. And a lot of things actually remained. Okay.
But that's also something Dominique Gonzalez-Förster often talks about, because she says certain rituals in Africa, for example, only occur every 100 years. And obviously the beauty of the ritual you invented, in a way, is that it has this long durational slowness. It's every 10 years. The Escher piece, over 40 years, kept coming back, has each time a different meaning. The Nauman piece for 30 years couldn't happen, and then suddenly happened. How did this idea came about, that you slow down the ritual?
I think it has a lot to do with the kind of humor, or people who are not from there don't understand that people there have a humor. I think they have a great sense of humor, but they don't talk. And with Dominique, it was interesting. She had, at the time, there was a bestseller, very popular, which deals in the Louvre. What is the name of this? American bestseller also. It's very interesting to read. It's very bad literature. Dan Brown, is that Dan Brown? Yeah. And it's about the Louvre, the inner structure of the Louvre. And she wanted to make a novel on Münster because she was, as a student, twice in Münster. And then she made a miniature garden, like a Disneyland, of previous pieces. And some of the artists in previous works, like Richard Serra, right? They were very, very upset. Also, some of my colleagues from earlier times were very upset because they thought we made fun of famous art, right? And then I always responded with a wonderful quote of Robert Filiou, a French artist, who said, art is too important to take it too important, right? Kunst ist zu wichtig, es wichtig zu nehmen. So that the pompous, one should take the hot air out of it and make it available without any arrogance to people who are open.
So now it's really lucky that we have two sessions, because we definitely will need them, because we have, of course, now the 87 show, and maybe we can talk a little bit about 87, and then in the afternoon, talk about 97 and 07, and of course the future. Can you talk a little bit about some
I think there are some more pictures,
here?
Right?
Yeah.
For instance, this is now being restored. And he was very, very, very current artist at the time. There was Scott Burton and Sia Ahmadjani. Sia Ahmadjani is Persian. He's a Sufi. He's a very, very, very well-read and idealistic, philosophically person. He is very, very close to a kind of American 18th century philosophy and idealism. And he made this reading room with quotes of Walt Whitman and quotes of Thoreau and so on, and it is in between the Institute of American History and Literature and a theology of Protestant theology. And this, for instance, is the most inexpensive work ever done in Münster. Lothar Baumgarten, he is kind of an anthropologist, artist, typographer. He had a very ambitious project, and it became too expensive. And then in the last minute, he decided to put 3 45-watt lamps in these cages. And these are the true cages of the Anabaptists, you see, who threw over the bishop, threw the bishop out of town, then the bishop reconquered. They are heroes, for instance, of the Mennonites in Pennsylvania, and there was an opera written about them. There were kind of Trotskyists who made them into heroes. Then they were forbidden during the Nazi time, and so on. So it's a very complex ideological interpretation. And Münster is world famous for true reasons, because that was the end of the 30 Years' War with the Peace of Münster, where the Catholics, the Spanish, had a conference for 3 years in Münster, and the Protestants, the Swedish, in Osnabrück, which is a town nearby. And that was basically the first time that a treaty was worked out not while the war was still going on. And there's an artist now, Alexandra Perici, a young artist from Romania, who is a dancer and who will make a work in connection to the site of the Westphalian peace, and also in connection to new technology of fluent kind of information.
And maybe we can do one more piece before we break, which was, of course, the icon of the 87 show, Katharina Fritsch.
Yeah, so I rather talk about the photo than the piece, because this photo was taken in a wonderful issue of Domus magazine at that time, and you see the Madonna of Lourdes enlarged in this stark yellow next to a department store. On the other side there, the kind of paraphernalia, Catholic store for candles and for clothing for Catholic priests and so on. And this Madonna you see everywhere locally in hospitals and old age homes and so on. And it is also the beginning of kitsch, when a mass production would celebrate something which was multiplied many times. And this photograph is special because you see a Muslima walking along. But at that time, you just see an interesting women in white clothes. And 10 years ago, in the countryside, all the women, all the nuns and all the women in church were very much dressed like that too when I was a child. Today, it would be completely differently read, hysterically looked upon. And so 10 years, again, is an interesting way of looking at things. It slows down, and it makes art where you don't expect it. And museums become more and more corporate spaces, so it's the opposite should happen in the public realm, because it will only be there for 3 months and then it's gone. Right?
And there could not be a better point to break. We'll convene again with all of you and Kasper at 5 minutes past 3, I think Steffi said. So to continue then and to talk more about the amazing ritual, or as Tino Segal would say, what are the new rituals which are appropriate for our time. Kasper, thank you so much. Thank you.